Bienvenue. Welcome this evening. Thank you very much for coming. This is exciting to have everybody here. This is part of the Sister Cities lecture series for the Alexandria Pont Sister Cities, and so we're very excited all the time to have every few months a nice presentation to bring a community together. So I just wanted to say a few words about Sister Cities International because I found a lot of people don't know what it is. It started after World War II. Eisenhower decided that there really needed to be a bridge of communities internationally to kind of help future conflict. He thought that it would be better to maybe go people to people, person to person, instead of only government to government. So in fact, that's what we are. We're a representative of 17 appointed members of the citizen community here in Alexandria. So we're not an official city employees, but just volunteers that try to put Francophile type of activities together. So you are here for our lecture series. Just yesterday, we were excited to confirm that our next lecture series will be January 22nd. And Francois Furstenberg is a professor at Johns Hopkins University, and he just released a very interesting book that I believe is in the Washington Post right now for a review. It's called When the U.S. Spoke French, and it chronicles 5 refugees from the French Revolution that came to the United States. So that should be interesting. You'll be getting more notice about that if you sign up for our listserv, which you'll find the paper downstairs if you didn't already. I just wanted to make a few announcements. That was the lecture. The other one is if you're interested in French language lessons, we don't have a room or a date yet, but sometime in the new year, one of our members is a French teacher. She runs FrenchandBC.com, and she's willing to offer her services to benefit our student exchange program. So if you're interested in it, we'll get you more details when we have them, but please find one of our members for more information. We also have a student exchange. It's for 9th, 10th, and 11th graders. If anybody you know fits that profile and is interested in French, please contact one of our members. And finally, our D-Day event is really our big event that we started 4 years ago. And that will be June 6th is, in fact, the anniversary of D-Day, but we have a lecture the Thursday before, which is June 4th, right here at the Lyceum. And on Market Square with World War II memorabilia and reenactors and music. It's getting bigger and better every year, so mark your calendar for that as well. It's so exciting to have all these events to tell you about, but I do want to move on to tonight's presentation. Tom is one of our committee members. We are very glad to have him as a member of our committee for the last 2 years. He is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, Madison, with a bachelor's and master's degree in European history. He served for 24 years in combat and staff positions in the U.S. Army. While in the Army, Lieutenant Christensen taught European history at the United States Military Academy, West Point, and the military history at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He also taught military history at the University of Wisconsin while he was serving as the professor of military science. For 9 years after military retirement, he and his wife Darlene conducted battlefield tours of European World War I and World War II sites in Italy, France, and Germany. He later joined the government service and has served as historian at the 63rd Regional Support Command in Moffett Field, California, and then as the U.S. Army Military Police historian at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Since October 2012, he is a senior historian at the Office of the Secretary of Defense History. He and his lovely wife, Darlene, who has been a great support for our committee as well, live here in Alexandria, and he's just a fun, very interesting, wonderful guy who has a ton of information, so I really encourage you to think of questions after his lecture, and you'll get a good response, I'm sure. I think that is everything. We have a lot of stuff that our committee does, so check our website out and sign up for more information.
good. First of all, let me again say thank you and again emphasize this is an Alexandria Comp sister city event. We're very, very fortunate, I think, also to have in Alexandria Comp as our sister city. A couple thank yous, specifically and mostly this presentation. I need to thank Dr. Anthony Crane back there, who's running the projector. We worked together in the Office of Secretary of Defense History, and Tony did most of the hard work here, so I'm just up here talking. But I really appreciate that, Tony. The other person I want to thank is my wife, Darlene. She's already been noted, but she shared with me many of the battlefields and museums, tolerated them in some cases because I sometimes couldn't get enough. And we went from Verdun to the Meuse-Argonne to Normandy, et cetera, so I'd like to thank her for this opportunity also. I want to emphasize before I get started that the purpose of this lecture tonight is in no way intended to glorify war. In fact, it's just the opposite. You'll see that this is the most horrific war when it comes to an experience by human beings, I think, that the world has ever suffered. All war is cruel and horrible, of course, but the First World War was indeed horrific in many cases as far as human suffering, both physically and mentally. Rather, though, this is a lecture that commemorates and remembers those who were in this war. And they were in this war not oftentimes by choice, although many volunteered early on because, of course, the war was going to be over by Christmas, remember, in 1914. Some couldn't wait to get over there. Of course, in the United States, and I'm going to cover this later, doesn't come in until 1917, but many Americans, believe it or not, when the Canadians joined almost immediately in the war effort in 1914, many Americans went to Canada and joined. More than 60,000 Americans served in Canadian forces in World War I, 60,000. And of course, many of those soldiers, American soldiers, are buried overseas in Canadian and Commonwealth cemeteries. And I think tonight, because we have the sister city of France, it's especially to commemorate the French and the suffering of the French people. Because almost the entire war, 90% of the war was fought in France and in portions of Belgium with French-speaking peoples. And they suffered the most. And when I get to the casualties, you're going to see, and this is incredible, that 75% of all French combatants were either killed or wounded. 75%. We as Americans think we suffered horrendous casualties in World War I. They were significant, and I'll get to that later in the presentation. But our percentage was 8%. The French suffered 75%. It also causes us to stop and think about what happened in May 1940, when the French seemed to give up so easily. We might have more of an appreciation, I think, for the French suffering in the First World War and what it meant later on. So let's move along. This is the first slide. It has to do with the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was a plan by the Germans in which they were going to invade France, and it was designed far sooner than the war occurred by a guy called von Schlieffen, obviously. And it was to sweep, and his motto was, "Let the last Prussian grenadier rush the channel with his right sleeve," okay? And that meant they were going to come and make a swing in toward Paris. And it was a design plan because they knew they had to attack and gain France before the Russians were going to attack from the other side, because during the Entente phase, the Triple Entente was France, Russia, and Great Britain. They needed to knock out France and then be able to put their soldiers against the Russians because they thought it was going to take the Russians longer to mobilize. Well, we're going to see that that plan didn't quite work. It came close, but it didn't quite work. There's a lot of close calls in the First World War. Next slide, please. You can see is a polyglot nation. All of this, we think of Austria as a small country today, around Vienna. But at the time, right before the First World War, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was not only Austria, Hungary, parts of Poland, all of Czechoslovakia, Bosnia, Croatia, Yugoslavia, everything that we can see on the map there. So it's a tremendous area. And of course, the war is going to start in that area. Next slide. And it's going to start again with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Most of you are familiar with that. He goes to visit in Sarajevo. He is met there by a team of assassins, Serbian Slavs. Of course, the Serbians were backed by the Russians. Serbian Slavs want to knock off Gavrilo, or knock off Franz Ferdinand. And of course, the guy that eventually kills Franz Ferdinand that day is none other than Gavrilo Princip. He's the guy on the right. Gavrilo Princip actually saw the motorcade go by in the morning and chickened out the first time. He didn't draw his revolver, didn't throw his grenade. But somebody else did throw the grenade farther down the road. And the Archduke actually saw it coming and put up his hand. It bounced off his hand, bounced on the street, and blew up. And the car following him had some serious injuries based upon that grenade. Those people were immediately taken to the hospital. Franz Ferdinand went and did his appointment. It's amazing that the mayor of Sarajevo had a prepared speech, and he continued, regardless of what had happened just previously, saying, "We in Sarajevo all are very, very happy to see you." Okay? Probably not a good thing. Franz Ferdinand didn't think that was a very good joke, but he went on like nothing had happened. Well, anyway, Franz Ferdinand was supposed to go to an appointment, and instead he decides he's going to go visit the people in the hospital, those that were injured in that car from the morning grenade throw. And he told everybody except the most important guy, the driver. And off they go. And at a certain point, everybody sees they're going the wrong way, and everybody's waving their hands, and the driver goes, "Oh, you got to turn around. We're going to go down over here." And so the driver turns down this one street, and just by chance, Gavrilo Princip happens to be standing there, actually bemoaning the fact that he had chickened out in the morning, and he, literally by chance, the car pulls right up to him and starts to turn around. And at that point, Gavrilo Princip regained some courage, or whatever you want to call it, jumped up on the running board, fired into the Archduke and his wife Sophie. The Archduke said, "Sophie lived for me." She did not. He did not. So what happens is a chain of events in which the Russians back the Serbs, the Austrians back are mad, obviously. They mobilize, the Russians start to mobilize. What happens then is with the Russians mobilizing, the Germans start to mobilize, getting the forces ready. When the Germans start to mobilize, the French start to mobilize. Blah, 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 blah. What happens is that the war literally, within 2 weeks to 4 weeks, falls into the bloodiest war in human mankind up to that time. Okay? So you have the First World War starting. And the major powers, of course, are the English, the French, and the Russians on one side, and the Germans and the Austrians on the other side. Next slide, please. Here you can see the initial euphoria. In France especially, again, this is, we're the sister city with Grand France. In France especially, most of you have been to Paris and seen the Place de la Concorde and all the statues of the French provinces. The French had been beaten by the Prussians in 1870, rather badly beaten, and very quickly. And they had actually, and the Germans had taken Alsace-Lorraine away from France and incorporated it in their country. And they had put a shroud over the province of Alsace-Lorraine in the Place de la Concorde. All the French provinces are there in statuettes. They had put a shroud over. And there was one thing on every Frenchman's lips: revanche. They wanted revenge. They were going to take it back. And so there was a spirit of militarism, and it existed in every country. And so when a call went out, people joined up. People couldn't wait to join up. everybody was afraid that they were going to miss it. Next slide. There in Munich, you can see there was a Austrian who happened to be in Munich at the time, and his name was Adolf Hitler. And he's in the, if you've been to Munich, you know where I'm talking about, Feldherrenhalle. He's there in the plaza, and he's cheering with everybody else. And of course, he's in the crowd. They found him later in history, and they circled him. You can see he's quite happy about the war. He does become a corporal, of course. Next slide. Okay, the early war was a war of movement. It looked like it was going to be like the War of 1870, all over again. The Germans attacked, and they attacked, and they attacked. They actually attacked for almost 3 days straight without sleeping. And later, we're going to, the next slide, please, Tony. You're going to see, again, they get almost all the way to Paris. Next slide. But then we have what's called the miracle of the Marne. The French stopped them at the Marne. And you'll see a lot of movies how French taxi cabs from Paris sent soldiers out to the front, and that occurred, but that wasn't the real miracle. What happened was, and recent historians have only come upon this, is that they realized that the Germans had attacked for 3 or 4 days straight, had gotten almost all the way to Paris, and were literally tired. Think about it. Have you ever been up for 3 or 4 days carrying a pack, marching? That was the miracle of the Marne, almost as much as the French resistance. But the French do resist, and they start building a front then. Next slide. Here you can see it again. Is there another slide, Tony? Next one? No. Okay, back up. They start building a front that extends in trench warfare all the way from Paris to the North Sea. And what happens is, every side is trying to outflank the other. Just as the other side goes to the right flank, the other one fills in, and so forth. Until the front now extends all the way from the North Sea all the way down to Switzerland. A series of trenches. And you can see the trenches here. Both British soldiers, French soldiers. Very, very, very difficult life. I'm going to talk a little bit about trench warfare in this life, but understand that it is a war of stagnation. It is a war in which there is no movement. Because you have new weapon systems entailed. Weapon systems that the forces that are using them don't know exactly what they can do and what they can't do. Next slide. You can see again the trench warfare. Remember, when the Germans come in, they're all the way almost to Paris. They're pushed back a bit, but the line is established, and the line always runs for about 3.5 to 4 years, almost 4 years in the war, from the North Sea to Switzerland, but it always runs through Belgium and France. Keep that in mind. The war is not in Germany. It's in France. The Germans are in France the entire war, and in a good part of France. And so it's up to the French and the English, their English allies, to push them back. The English, of course, joined by the South Africans and most importantly, the Canadians. And that pushback occurs very, very slowly. In fact, so slowly that the Germans counterattack and take back anything that the enemy, that the British and French take. And so what you have is a war in which there is little movement, in which machine gun fire covers the entire battlefield, in which artillery fire covers the entire battlefield. Imagine a battle, one day, 3 million artillery shells. 3 million. And we're talking about on a front that might be from here to Bethesda, Maryland. 3 million shells are expended in one day. And remember that every time an artillery shell hits in these days, the killing radius is 25 to 50 meters. Now, if you are in a trench, you're safe because the shell explodes and the shrapnel goes out. If you're standing up outside the trench, you're not. But many of the shells, when you shoot 3 million, hit the trenches too. And so the trenches cave in, etc. And so you're going to have trenches there for the entire time. And it's not just one row of trenches. There are usually 4 rows of trenches, joined by what they call communication trenches. And so in this war of no movement, even if you do take by your attack the first trench, guess what? You've got 3 more to go. Okay? And the enemy is probably going to counterattack. And if you lose, as an example, some of the French attacked and they lost 90% of their men in the first attack in 17 to 19 minutes. 90% casualties. And so even if you do take that trench, what do you do then? You're getting ready for the counterattack, which is going to come and probably push you back out or kill the 10% that made it. So it's a war of stagnation. People are sitting there under horrific conditions. Next slide. Here you can see an artillery shell that hit inside the trench area. I think, again, World War I is the most horrific of wars as far as conditions. Trenches would fill with water. They would have hand pumps to pump the water out. Trench foot is just what it means. It means that you're constantly in water because you were in the trenches. Trench water would be anywhere from 6 inches to a foot deep. Your feet would always be wet. And then you had to deal with other wonderful items, like lice. 95% of the people suffered from lice. Okay? And they would get together during their free time, when they weren't in the attack, and they would chat. That's how we get our word chat. A chat is a lice, a louse. And then this chatting meant they would pick the lice off of each other. And it now has become part of our vocabulary. So when you sit down and have a chat with somebody, you know that you're not really picking lice off them, okay? And I don't think too many of you probably knew that's where the word came from, chatting. You were picking lice off the other person. They would get in the seams, they would run a candle down the seams, okay? And all the lice would just scurry. It was pretty horrific. Next slide. Here you can see attempts to take care of bodies. Most of the time, if during an attack, which was over no man's land, okay, the bodies would be left out in no man's land because you couldn't go out and retrieve the bodies and dispose of them. There were occasional timeouts, literally, that both sides called to retrieve bodies. That did happen. Okay, there was also the famous Christmas truce that some of you have heard about, read about, or seen on TV. But one of the fallacies is, I think, that most of you think this happened every Christmas. It only happened in 1914. Only in 1914 was there a Christmas truce, where the soldiers from both sides got up, went out, and actually exchanged gifts, okay, or traded belt buckles and things like that. And later on, I have a German belt buckle up here. It says "Gott mit uns" on it, which means God is with us. Okay, the French didn't necessarily agree to that. But you had that truce only for the first Christmas. So again, horrific conditions. Next slide. Here you can see the wounded. You see a German soldier right here assisting other soldiers. Now, the soldiers themselves, when the wars first started, trenches were actually quite close to each other. And sometimes they would even have truces. Truces meaning, you don't throw a grenade at me and I won't throw it at you, okay? But as the war continued, the trenches kept getting farther apart. Until sometimes they were almost a half a mile apart from each other. Initially, some people would start throwing grenades. The first grenade, by the way, it's called a tortoise grenade. Pretty primitive. It had cartridges around it. Okay, this is the real deal. Don't pull the pin. No. And you'd throw it like a frisbee kind of over at the other side. Now, hopefully, according to the guys that were throwing it, it would strike one of the cartridges on something hard and set the grenade off. This didn't always work though. So sometimes these were exchanged several times. So the guys that threw it, sometimes got it back in return. So they ended up thinking, we need a better method of killing people. So they came up with the pineapple grenade and the potato masher and things like that the Germans had. That was the earliest grenade. And as I said though, the no man's land kept shifting and getting farther apart. And there were so many bodies out there from the attacks that the most serious problem that many people had was not only the smell of being in the trenches, okay, from the bloating and rotting bodies, but rats. Rats were enormous. Some soldiers wrote in their diary they were as big as dogs. Now, I'm not sure that was true, but they were enormous. They would be in the trench. Regiments would have competitions about how many rats they could bayonet in the trench with them, okay? And I think I found one account that one guy got 33 in about a week. And he actually kept them because they had a competition. They would get an extra ration of rum. And by the way, before any attack, the French were given wine, okay, in bountiful quantities, okay? The English and Belgians oftentimes got rum. The rum jars, and the French used rum too sometimes when they could get it. The rum jars were made out of ceramics, and on the rum jar was the initials SRD. And this meant Supply Reserve Depot. The soldiers, however, called it soon runs dry, or seldom reaches destination, okay? Because obviously rum was looked upon as a very, very great thing to have. Next clip. Here you can see the Western Front from 1915. Again, you can see it's bent all the way from Belgium. And Verdun is down here. This is Verdun in this area. This is where the French will put up tremendous resistance. Verdun is probably the most famous battle for the French. The guy that stops the Falkenhayn offensive at Verdun is a guy called Marshal Pétain. Now, he will later be vilified in World War II as a traitor. But I think you'll understand a little bit and have some empathy for him in that he saw tremendous attrition taking place at Verdun. Because the battle goes from February until December with almost 1 million casualties. 1 million at Verdun. Has anybody been to Verdun? You know there's an ossuary there. An ossuary is a bone place for remains. There were so many French killed at Verdun and German intermingled on the battlefield after the war that they would take hay rakes to rake up the bones on the battlefield and place them in the ossuary, in the memorial. The battlefield still has bones on it. It still has the trenches on it. It still has the forts on it. The reason I was able to collect all these things, these cartridges, was quite easy actually, in the parts of France and Belgium where the battles occurred, particularly in France, in the Somme area. And the reason is because the front doesn't change for more than 10 kilometers or 6 to 7 miles over a 3.5-year period. And so there are millions of cartridges out there, millions, still out there. In the spring, when the farmers plow their fields today, you still have, because because 2/3 of the artillery shells went off, heavy artillery, 1/3 didn't. They were duds. You still have live rounds with live warheads on them being harvested, literally. They call it the iron harvest every spring. And you'll see them as you're making your way in these battlefield areas along the side of the road because farmers have plowed them up and bomb disposal units will come and pick them up. They're there. 60 tons every year. Now, this war occurred 100 years ago. So imagine, again, as I said before, 1 million shells just in a day, 2 days, 3 days. How many million shells in all? We don't know. But it's an incredible thing. And the front basically stabilizes and stays there almost the entire war until some things happen. Next slide. Here you can see, again, some fighting. Artillery was the king of battle. It's still called the king of battle today. Some of the shells from the big guns could travel 30, 40 miles. Big Bertha, named after Bertha Krupp, one of the daughters of the Krupp family from Germany, was shooting shells into Paris, more than 50 miles away from Paris. Imagine firing a shell as big as your washing machine, 50 miles. Next slide. And of course, this was the war of innovation. And there were many weapon systems that were used. Of course, the most famous was the tank, obviously, as you see in the picture there. And by the way, there were, not to be sexist, but there were male tanks and female tanks. Did you know that? A male tank had a great big gun on it. Okay? A female tank just had machine guns. And they actually called them that. There were 2 male tanks and 2 female tanks in every tank squad. 4 tanks altogether, in every tank platoon, excuse me. Now, tanks were generally used in a piecemeal fashion. Courcelette, their first used in 1916 to assist in the attack. The Germans were afraid of them. The problem was, once they got down in the trench, they oftentimes couldn't get back out. Okay? And so they become very vulnerable. Many of them break down on the battlefield. They are not very effective. But both sides will eventually develop tanks. The Americans will have a tank also that looks a little bit differently than this. Airplanes were used for the first time, and most of you know, based on Snoopy and the Red Baron, okay? Or he's chasing the Red Baron on Richthofen, right? The great estates of the Germans. That airplanes were fitted with machine guns. Initially, they were just shooting at each other with pistols, and then they were taking rifles up, machine guns. Many times they would shoot off their propellers, okay? So they figured, we've got to do something about that. So they figured out, we're going to iron plate the propellers, and that worked for a little bit. And then the Germans, copied by the French, figured out how to synchronize the propeller so that a bullet would go in between the blades of the propeller as it was whirling around. And so there were a lot of combats in World War I, but was generally to keep the other side from knowing what you were doing, observation. And so the fighter planes were fighting each other to see whether they could establish air superiority and be able to spy on the other side to know what was happening. And they used balloons also. And I might add, lots of balloons were used for observation. And balloons would be hoisted up right near the trenches, go up and take a look and try to come down before the other side could see them, to send an airplane that would shoot them down because they were very vulnerable, obviously. By the way, and I think this is something about psychology and warfare, pilots in the First World War were not allowed to have parachutes. Parachutes were there. If you were in a balloon, you were allowed to have a parachute. But if you were flying a plane, no. Why? It's too expensive to jump out of a plane because you might not really be in danger, okay? So we don't want these pilots just jumping out of their plane for no reason. Let's get them shot down, okay? We'll make sure that they're really in combat before. So parachutes were not worn by pilots. They were worn by men that manned the balloons. Okay, next slide. Poison gas. Poison gas was a big killer. The Canadians go through the first poison gas attack in 1915, but soon all sides are using it. The Germans, the French use it all the time. Now, poison gas needs one thing to be just right. It's called wind. because oftentimes poison gas was released based on an order to release it at this time, and suddenly the wind would change. Guess what? The poison gas that you were hoping was going to go over the enemy ends up coming over you. Initially, there were no protective masks, no gas masks as we know them, in 1914 or 1915. The Canadians, and soon the French followed suit, and the Germans, realized that if you urinated on your gauze bandage, held it over your face, the uric acid would break down the gas. And so that was a means, believe it or not, a horrible means, but a means to survive a gas attack. Obviously, that requires that you have to go to the bathroom. Seriously. It's funny, but it's not funny, because maybe you had just went. And if you had, you were out of luck. And the casualties were horrific initially from poison gas. Different types of gas are developed. Mustard gas, which got, a prick. When I was a lieutenant, and it was one of my additional duties, was an MBC officer, had to go to a school in Vilseck, Germany, and they wanted to show us just what would happen, okay, if you had some gas, okay, just a prick. And so they don't do this anymore, thank goodness. I'm surprised, they would take just a pin thing, dip it into the stuff, put it on your finger, and you would immediately have a blister about that big. It would just pop up like a water blister. But it was just like the tiniest amount you can imagine. So you can imagine when this stuff came over you, what would happen. And it was horrific. Did it change the war? No, not really. Because both sides quickly adapted to it. Both sides quickly used it. The French suffered incredible casualties to poison gas, but they also inflicted incredible casualties using poison gas. All sides used it. Adolf Hitler himself was gassed 3 times. He was in the hospital when the war ended in 1918. That might be one of the reasons that he never used poison gas, and we never used it in World War II. Next slide. Here you can see soldiers lining up. They're suffering from gas wounds. Many times they would be blinded, and you'll see whole lines of soldiers, sometimes a mile long, one holding the others because they didn't know where they were going. And they were marching to aid stations. Hand grenades, as I said before, were another item that was very, very much used. I've already showed you one. Indirect artillery fire. Previous wars, if you think about it, in the Civil War, you were firing a cannon at something you could see, right? You see the Union, you see the Confederates or vice versa, and they'd fire at them with a cannon. In the First World War, you're getting what we call indirect artillery fire. You're firing at targets you don't see, based upon information you're getting. And wireless communications or runners would communicate that back to the firing battery. So you might be firing at a target 5 miles away. You don't see it, but you're putting steel on that target. And that's the steel that you see there, the shrapnel. These are pieces of shrapnel coming off an artillery shell. An artillery shell would generally have anywhere from 100 to 150 pieces like this coming off of it. If it didn't explode just right, you got what's left up there. That's when the shell didn't explode properly. But generally speaking, the shells would explode and leave that. These whirring pieces of metal, as I said before, had a killing radius of 25 to 50 meters or yards. And I mean, they were just as deadly as a bullet. But not as neat, if you know what I mean, because they're whirring around. And if you haven't, and you want to later on, you can come up and hold them, but they're everywhere on the battlefield. But indirect artillery fire. The other thing that I think is important, this is the first war where machine guns were used absolutely extensively. And I can't tell you what a science of killing occurred with machine guns. It was horrible. Because you just wouldn't have machine guns put here and there. There was a science to it. And you would stake your machine guns. We still do that today. In today's Army, we teach this. Okay? You put a stake here, and you put a stake here, and that machine gun then covers back to that stake and back to that stake. And there's another machine gun down farther, maybe 100 yards, right? And he's got it intersected also. So he covers your space to where you left off. And so you are covering the battlefield with a sheet of machine gun fire. The only way you can get through in an attack, and it was difficult, was to have that artillery bombardment precede the attack and hope that you might get some of those machine gun nests. The problem was, when those artillery bombardments occurred, generally the enemy would just go underground. The Germans had extensive trenches, beautiful trenches actually, I must say, underneath their trench. They would have rooms, they'd have coffee pots set up, they'd have pictures of their wives in their trench, the Germans. Why? Because they were in France, they were staying, okay? The French and the English, and particularly the French, were not allowed to have good trenches. So they dug these trenches for protection. They weren't allowed to like modernize them and really make them nice to live in. And the reason is because we're going to attack. If we make it too comfortable for the soldiers, we'll never get the Germans out of here. And so you see the problem there. Okay, next slide. Here you see the Russians. The reason I have this slide on is because Russia was very much a part of the First World War up to a certain point. And then we're going to have a Russian Revolution. You see the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II. You see his lovely wife. And of course the guy on the left is our favorite guy, Rasputin, right? Who was very, very influential to the White. I just throw that slide up there because it is a rotting empire. In 1905, they already had a revolution. They had big problems. Now they get involved in the First World War. The soldiers, the German soldiers who meet the Russians, and the reason they do so quickly is because they do not succeed in France. The French stop the attack on the Marne River and push the Germans back. And so they suddenly have to switch forces and head to Russia. They do it because of the French. The French are the heroes during this portion of the war, without a doubt. They have saved the world, literally. And the Russians attack and they take horrible losses. They're destroyed in the Battle of the Masurian Lakes. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, later to become famous on the Western Front, are the victors against the Tsar, and Russia is pretty much knocked out of the war. Next slide. You can see there were a number of revolutions. The first revolution kept the Russians in the war. Kerensky was in that, and then later the Bolsheviks under Lenin take over, and one of the first things they say is make peace, and they made peace with the Germans. But what do you think happens to the German army then, that so many Germans are on the Eastern Front? Where are they going to go? Against France. Again, the main objective of the German army is always France. Next slide. There you see the Russian front. Next slide. The French, by 1917, have been bled like you can't believe. The casualties are enormous. I'm going to talk about it later on, but out of the total of 8 million some Frenchmen, more than 6 million become casualties. And most of those are in the very early part of the war. So again, whenever somebody talks about the French in May 1940 and Pétain giving up, the French lost 75% of their entire army, okay, and killed and wounded in the First World War. By 1917, the war looks like it might be won by the Germans. Now, Woodrow Wilson campaigned for peace. Keep out of the war. Americans were going to stay out of the war. But the Germans decide that they're going to increase a thing called unrestricted submarine warfare. Because of the supplies going to France and to England, the Germans start to torpedo neutral ships. And most of you have heard of the Athenia, or more famously, I guess, the Lusitania. And my dad, the Lusitania was sunk by German torpedoes. There were Americans on board. It helped propel the Americans into the war. I might add, though, as an aside, it's heading to England, and it did have supplies for France. The Lusitania claimed that they had no war supplies. The Germans knew they did through agents, and they put an ad in the New York Times several days before and said, "Don't get on the Lusitania, bad idea." And yet many Americans did, and it went down. It does help propel, though, this whole series of sinkings of what we consider neutral ships. But our neutral ships were, in fact, supplying both England and France, specifically, trying to keep them in the war. But it's what finally brings Woodrow Wilson to decide that America has no choice, they must enter the war. So we enter the war in April 1917. I must say that our army was almost non-existent at that time. Very, very small, minuscule. The Germans are betting on one thing. It will take the Americans at least 1 to 1.5 years to mobilize and put an army in the field in France. They're betting on it. They're betting the fact that they can break the blockade that the English have put up around Germany through submarine warfare. They can break that, and they're going to attack. Later in 1917, it turns out they don't attack till March 1918. But they're absolutely convinced that they can win the war before the Americans have an opportunity to get in, regardless of whether they declare war or not. So it's a race. And lucky for us, we are able to repay the debt of Lafayette. As you know, Lafayette came to the United States to help George Washington, to Alexandria. In fact, he visited Alexandria even later. Came back to Alexandria and visited Alexandria later after the French Revolution. But at any rate, the motto of the Americans oftentimes was Lafayette, we are back. Okay, we're here to repay that debt. And the Americans come into France just in the nick of time, because in 1917, the French army is reeling. The French army has suffered tremendous casualties. Now when French officers tell their men to get up from the trenches and attack, they're going, no, we're not attacking anymore. What do you do under a situation like that? Some of you have seen the movie with Kirk Douglas, What Price Glory? And you talk about the mutinying of the French army and soldiers refusing to attack. The solution of the French officers was that 1 out of every 10 soldiers would be shot, okay, to keep the rest of them from mutinying. And unfortunately, it didn't make any difference if you were a good soldier or a bad soldier, okay? If you had the misfortune of drawing the wrong straw, you would be shot, and you were shot during that time period to end the mutiny. And it's just at this time that the Americans are mobilizing their forces. It's also just at this time that the Germans are designing an attack that's going to end the war. They know they have one more throw of the dice. They've been able to move all their soldiers from Russia to France, and they're going to attack the French. They're going to take care of the French once and for all. They know that the French are hurting. They are hurting themselves also, and they know they must end the war quickly. Next slide. Here you see the Germans getting ready. They come up with new tactics in 1918 called storm troop tactics, small unit tactics, squads of men, heavily armed. Generally, some of them had a mobile machine gun with them, preceded by artillery fire, but just in front of them, okay? Not for days before, letting the enemy know we're coming, but just a few minutes before. Tremendous artillery bombardment, it would end, and right away the soldiers would move out. Yes, they took a lot of casualties in friendly fire. They also have their new weapons also, including their version of the tank. Notice the German tank. But the storm troops that the Germans used are very, very effective. And they finally break that stalemate in March 1918. They finally break that stalemate on the Western Front, and they push. But it never happened before. 100 kilometers, so they get within shooting distance again, artillery shooting distance of Paris. And they're just there, they're this close. And not only do they run out of gas, but the Americans arrived sooner than they expected. They arrived in late 1917, just as the front is starting to fold. And just in March of 1918, the Americans are actually able to fill the holes of the French soldiers where they have retreated and been broken. They literally are there about 10 days. It's a 10-day window. That's how close our side came to losing the First World War. About 10 days. Pershing and the Americans get there. And because of that, the German offensive runs out of steam. And the Germans take tremendous casualties. One of the problems, it's not a problem, one of the advantages, I guess, of the Americans is, quite frankly, they don't know enough not to be careless. They don't know enough that they attack and meet the Germans. They haven't reeled from 3.5 years of combat like the French and the British on that front. And the Americans push forward into those holes and stop the German attack just in time. They saved the French. It is a known fact that the French are so friendly because of what the Americans did at that time in 1918. And if you take a look at American casualties, in just a very short time, in less than 9 months, American casualties are following: 204,000 wounded, this is less than 9 months, and 116,000 killed. Again, you can see, France has suffered 75% of their soldiers involved in World War I were killed or wounded. Americans, 8%. But we've suffered tremendous casualties over that very small window, and it's just in the nick of time. I can't overemphasize it enough. The Germans are actually pushing that close to Paris. Next slide. This is the cemetery at Meuse-Argonne. Anybody been there besides me? Not that visited. Very, very beautiful cemetery. If you've been to the cemetery in Normandy at Colville-sur-Mer, you might think that's a big cemetery, and it is. 9,000, more than 9,000 soldiers. It's small compared to the Meuse-Argonne. Meuse-Argonne is much larger. The most horrific thing, I think, for me, as a military man, is to look at the dates of those soldiers' deaths that are buried in Meuse-Argonne. This is the area where Sergeant York was. Some of you have seen that movie too, right? In the Meuse-Argonne cemetery, all the soldiers buried there, 1.5 times more than those at Normandy. All the soldiers buried there were killed in October or early November. And of course, we all know the war ended on November 11th, 1918. Imagine all those soldiers. Imagine the loved ones in the States thinking and celebrating that the war is over, not knowing that, in fact, their loved ones might have been killed during that time period. The Americans are pushing forward quickly. The Germans are reeling. They're still in France, though. Okay? And that gives way to what happens in the Second World War, because Adolf Hitler, a young corporal, is in the hospital suffering from gas wounds, and he goes, wait a second. He goes, how could we have lost the war? German troops are still in France. That doesn't make sense. How could we lose? We're still in France. And that's what he writes in Mein Kampf. He says there must have been a conspiracy by somebody. The Kaiser was thrown out. Who'd they put in? Ebert and other people. Guess what they were? Jewish. How convenient for Adolf Hitler to blame the war on them, stab in the back. And isn't it convenient also in the beer hall putsch? The guy on Hitler's right was none other than his old, former, very high commander, which he wouldn't even been able to smile at as a corporal. It was Ludendorff. Next slide. Here again you see the cemetery. Incredibly well kept cemeteries. The American Battlefield Monuments does a great job of remembering those soldiers. Next slide. It's a monument at Montfaucon in France. Very, very beautiful monument. Next slide. Again, that was a church in Montfaucon that was taken by the Americans with French help. The artillery generally support came from French soldiers. So they were very much integrated, the French and the Americans. And again, that's our theme as sister city to Caen in France. Next slide. There's another cemetery. Next slide. And of course, this is the famous railroad car, Compiègne, in France, where the surrender was signed by the Germans when they finally do surrender. But remember, when they sign it, they really don't surrender. They sign what's called an armistice. An armistice really means what? Time out. Okay? It doesn't mean that they necessarily surrendered. The surrender doesn't occur until we get to Versailles, which I'll have a slide on that in a second. And sometimes in Americans, prior to, in fact, some of you might even remember that before the 1950s, when November 11th was changed to Veterans Day, it used to be called, in some cases, Armistice Day, right? That's why, because the armistice was signed at 11 o'clock on the 11th month, okay, in 1918. Next slide. By the way, that railroad car in 1940, one of the first things that Hitler did is he made the French capitulate in that same railroad car, and then he blew it up. Now there is a copy in France today, so you can go there and see the railroad car, but it's not the original. It was blown up by Hitler after he took over France in 1940. This shows the ossuary in Verdun, and this on the bottom right is called the Trench of the Bayonets. If you've ever been to Verdun, it was a trench. The monument was built by an American in honor of the French. There was a whole French squad standing in their trench with their bayonets up, holding their rifles like that, under terrific artillery bombardment, and they were literally covered with dirt and debris and suffocated under that debris. And the only thing they found was 10 bayonets sticking out of the ground that far. All the soldiers were killed standing up, or suffocated standing up. And that became kind of a memorial at Verdun. It's called the Trench of the Bayonets. In the ossuary, as I said before, it's horrific. But it is, I always say, this is where we should have the peace conferences. Because you look in the little windows in the back of the ossuary, and in rooms as large as this one, and there are probably 10 rooms as large as this one, are piles of bones. Fibulas, humeruses, craniums, etc. Bones piled from the floor to the ceiling, as big as this room, 10 rooms like that, of unidentified bodies from the First World War. Next slide. And then we have the Paris Peace Conference, the Versailles Treaty. Now what's the French attitude? Obviously it's one of revanche. Look what they did to our country. We're going to be as difficult to the Germans as we possibly can, and you can understand why. And so they are. But it was probably a mistake to be that way. It was probably a mistake. We showed how the Marshall Plan worked after World War II, where we reconstructed what we had destroyed, and it did work. It worked so well that they became selling more cars than we did. This this idea of revenge basically was a precursor and led to, I think you would say, the Second World War, because there was a reason for the Germans to say this isn't fair, and with the reparations and everything that they had to pay, when no means to pay them, and occupation by French forces, etc., it just led to the next war. So the Treaty of Versailles, and in that treaty, remember how the war started? It was a Serbian nationalist that shot Franz Ferdinand, an Austrian, right? Now where are the Germans and French in that? They're not there, okay? And yet, at Versailles, in the peace treaty, the Germans are forced to say, the war is our fault, we started the war. They're forced to sign that peace treaty. It was their only option. There was no other option. And of course, the leaders that signed it for the Germans happened to be Jewish. So you can see why the Nazis, initially right after the war, the beer hall purchase started in 1923. Hitler takes power being voted in 1933, even though he never has a majority and has barely 35 to 40% of the vote is his highest, but he's the largest party. And so the First World War is a punctuation almost to the Second World War. But again, next slide, is there a next slide? What I want to emphasize more than anything is the terrible suffering that France went through in this war. And it's a suffering that transcends the war itself and moves on until the next time they're invaded in May 1940. So maybe some of you, as I am, are more sympathetic to the French for giving up so easily in May 1940 to the Germans. They didn't want to see that happen again. And again, 1/3 of their adult male population dies, okay, or is maimed. And by maimed, meaning they lost a limb, okay, arm or leg, in the First World War. There are more than 3 times as many women following the First World War as men in France at that time. It's a horrible situation that the French are in. And you have to understand, I think, that to understand why they capitulate so soon in May 1940. Okay, I just want to, whoops, that was just the grenade, don't worry. I'll just point out a couple things here.
Here's the French bayonet, obviously. Cartridges, you can tell the difference between a German cartridge and a English or French cartridge. The rim on the cartridge indicates it's an Allied cartridge, by the way. And a rimless is a Mauser, okay, cartridge. So if you come up here later on and see it, you can pick it up and say, oh, this is a German cartridge. You sound real smart, you know, the next time you see one. This is a 303 round, but the French also had rims on their cartridges. So when you're in, what's really interesting is you're in the same field, okay, looking at, and you see this stuff laying in the fields, in the plowed fields, and you pick one up and you go, oh, German, and then you go another 2 steps and you see an Allied, French or British cartridge. These are German officer binoculars. They're actually still in pretty good shape. They're made in Munich. This is the belt buckle, German belt buckle. It says Gott mit uns, God's with us. Of course, the French helmet, the poilu, is here. And the German helmet right here, don't pick that one up, it's a little, it breaks apart, you know, I don't want it broken anymore. These are quite interesting. They're little lead balls. You find these everywhere. In Darlene and I found many in fields in France, particularly in the Somme area, the plowed fields. You'll find these lead balls everywhere. What it was is artillery shells that were designed to explode over the trenches and rain down on the soldiers. Because if you were in a trench and an artillery shell hit, you were generally protected as long as it didn't hit the trench, right? Because the shrapnel went like this. And as serious as the bombardment was, if you were in your trench, you had a good chance of surviving. Now, you might have shell shock. You might have shock so terrible, and this happened all the time, that you were bleeding from your ears. You couldn't hear for probably 2 or 3 days. But it wasn't that bad, because you were alive, right? But these things, these little bitty lead balls, come up here and pick them up. The other lead, okay, would explode over the trench and come down on you. And in an artillery shell this size, you'd have anywhere from 75 to 100 of these in there. And so these raining down on the soldiers in the trench, so they were not protected. A helmet generally would stop it unless it would take a direct hit of the helmet, and it would go through the helmet. But generally it would glance off, so it would help. But certainly your shoulders were totally vulnerable. So casualties were enormous. You'll find those all over. You'll see the ones that have a little mark on them because they hit a rock. You can actually tell when they came down to hit something hard. You can see bullets. You find bullets. Now this is the business part, because everybody knows this is one that I found that hadn't been fired yet, right? So this was in somebody's pouch. He hadn't put it in and fired it, because when you fire it, you end up just with your cartridge, right? Because the business end is what goes forward, okay? And that's the part that will hurt somebody. And so this one hadn't been fired. Actually, I stuck it back in there, because you're not allowed to bring back stuff that has powder in it. They kind of frown upon that. Goes through the machine, you know, at the airport, and it kind of like lights up everything, and then you have to explain why you've got these things. So what I do is I find these things, and I take them to the restroom and wash them out, get all the powder out of them if they're full, whatever, and bring them home. Okay, you can do that legally. Bugles were loaded. Bugles were used to start an attack. You jump up out of the trenches. The officers were generally jump up first. The life expectancy of a second lieutenant or a captain in the First World War was about 3 weeks. Okay, so many enlisted men were older enlisted men, not just younger, but older, because they didn't want to take a leadership role. Why should I? Because the first thing they do is jump up, blow the bugle, or blow their whistle. You've seen that in some of the movies too. Where they blow a whistle and then everybody would go over the top, right, in the attack. Or they blow a bugle. Well, the minute they did that, of course, the other side would start swinging that machine gun fire. Okay? And also we had a nice little thing, I didn't cover this before, but a nice little invention called barbed wire that was rolled out there in no man's land at night. Rolled out in such quantities, okay, that there were bales and bales and bales of this. There still are bales just outside of Eaton, okay, that haven't been used. They still have them piled up from the First World War that they haven't unwound, okay? And of course, to start an attack, you had to go out in front at night, because you were going to attack through certain areas, and cut the wire. Fun job. Any volunteers? Anybody want to go out there and cut the wire tonight? Because every now and then, just for fun, the enemy would sweep just to make sure everything was clean out there, back and forth. And if you were out there, not good. But you had people going out there cutting the wire, because the next day you were going to attack through those gaps in the wire. Or you would try to use your artillery to blow gaps in the wire. And that again worked sometimes, but didn't work other times. People would get hung up on the wire. Okay? They couldn't get any farther. They would be tangled in the wire. Or in Passchendaele, the land was so churned up, and the water table was so low, and the rain was the worst in more than 100 years of record. And they actually think that there was so much artillery that, as cloudy as it is, most of you have been to Belgium, and usually it's cloudy and rainy, okay? But as cloudy as it is there, see, it oftentimes doesn't rain. But with this tremendous artillery bombardment, suddenly, it's like seeding the clouds. You know, you've heard about explosions that would cause rain. And that it rained heavier from 1915 to 1918 than any other years in recorded history in Belgium. I don't think that's an accident. And so it became so wet and so muddy, they would have to put what they call duck boards out for the attack. So you could only attack on these boards, okay? If you fell off the board, you went into mud that was like quicksand, and you actually went down. It was that bad. And soldiers, during the attack, were not allowed to stop and pull somebody out, even if it was their closest friend. And oftentimes, when the attacks were beaten back, they would come back, and they would see the bayonets or parts of a hand sticking out of the mud. People had been suffocated. It was that horrendous. Passchendaele was noted for that. Passchendaele is a small village just outside of Ypres, Belgium. And at Ypres, Belgium, every night at 8 o'clock, every single night, 365 days a year. And if you ever go to Belgium, go to it. It's the most moving ceremony. They'll have the last post. And they'll play the bugles. They have a team of buglers. And in front there, they'll say this: "They shall not grow old as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them." And then you'll hear the crowd, "We will remember them." Every night. There's 77,000 names on the Menin Gate of soldiers who died in World War I, whose bodies were never identified or found. And if you go to many of the cemeteries, the majority of the soldiers in there are unknown, known but to God. Rudyard Kipling, most of you have heard of him. His son, John, was was medically not fit for service because he was legally blind. He had big Coke bottle type glasses. He struggled to become a soldier, struggled to become an officer. He was denied and denied and denied, and finally through his father, he was allowed to become a lieutenant. He lasted 1 week on the Somme. And Rudyard Kipling's wife never spoke to Rudyard Kipling after that, ever. They lived in the same house, they never spoke. So the war was a horrible war. And the sacrifices the French made were incredible. And the Americans helped the French. It's that, I think, relationship that has existed since the time of Washington, Rochambeau, and all the Americans and French together, and one that's continuing even today. I just want to conclude then by saying, I think one of the most beautiful pieces of poetry that came out of the First World War, of course, is one that most of you probably have heard, but I'll conclude with it. And it's called "In Flanders Field" by John McCrae. He was a Canadian medical doctor. His medical aid station is just outside of Ypres, Belgium. It's still there, next to a cemetery. It's a unique cemetery, though, in that usually the crosses are neatly lined in rows. In fact, he even say in his poem that they're in rows. But there was so much bombardment around that cemetery, around his aid station, that many of the bodies that are there, and those are the people that are buried in that cemetery, are those that succumbed to the wounds that he couldn't save. Many of the bodies that are buried there had to be buried 2 or 3 times because of the bombardment. And so they're going to see irregular ways that they were buried. In that cemetery also is one soldier struggling. He had went forward the night before on a night patrol, been decorated for it, and sent back to the rear as a bonus, a 3-day pass, because he had done so well. He brought back 3 German prisoners in that night patrol. He found some Germans out there snooping around in no man's land too. Brought them back with him. Say, "Hey, struggle, you did pretty good. You got a 3-day pass, go to the rear." He was killed by artillery fire about a mile from the front. He was 14 years old. So here's "In Flanders Field," and then that'll be the conclusion. "In Flanders fields, the poppies blow. Between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are dead,
Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw a sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Field. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hinds we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high, if ye break faith with us who die. We shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. John McCrae wrote this poem for his best friend, Alex Helmer. Alex Helmer was an artilleryman. John McCrae had been an artilleryman in the Boer War, had went back to Canada and become a doctor of medicine. He would often go and actually help Alex tend the guns when he was off from his medical duties. Well, Alex Helmer was killed in an artillery barrage. In fact, his body was never found or identified, just pieces of him. And John McCrae sat down and wrote this poem in honor of him and sent it to Punch magazine. It was published, probably the most famous World War I poem there is. So tonight, again, leave this session, I guess, with a feeling of appreciation and commemoration to all those French soldiers. And again, the statistics are sobering. The total statistics are more than 6 million French died and were wounded in World War I. 6 million. Okay? It is an incredible statistic. 1,357,000 of those, that total, were killed in action. 75% of all French combatants were killed or wounded in World War I. It is a mind-sobering statistic. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. I'll take a few questions for those that have questions. Yes, sir.
There's a famous phrase about British officers being about lying, being led by donkeys, and referring to incompetence. And I just wondered your view, because you made a comment earlier about people not appreciating the way technology has changed war. Were they mostly incompetent, or were they just not aware?
In some cases, they were very. The question had to do with whether, he's talking specifically about British officers, but I think you could translate it to just about any officers. Were the high-level officers very, very incompetent, okay, during this time period, sending soldiers forward and things like that? I would have to say yes to many extent, whether it was Haig or Foch or any of those. And the reason I say that is most often the highest ranking soldiers never visited the front, okay? And that is pretty pathetic, considering the masses and millions of men that they're sending forward. They never visited the front. They would send a staff officer. There's a famous little anecdote from Haig's British general. He sent his chief of staff to the front one day, and he came back and he said, "Well, what's it like up there?" He never, Haig's asking, "What's it like up there?" He said, "You can't believe it. It's horrible. You can't believe it." "What do you mean it's horrible?" I can't explain it. And he couldn't. And he just started stuttering, and he couldn't spit it out. And he was actually relieved, okay, from his position. And so they didn't, I think, see the battlefield. And you see some of that in the movie What Price Glory, where you see the higher ranking officers, this is noble and everything else. They don't understand what it's like to be a soldier, I think, under these conditions. And when they have these great and grandiose plans to attack, without any real chance of success, they were also oftentimes told, whatever you do, do not run toward the enemy. Walk firmly. Okay, wait a second. Okay, walk firmly. What does that mean? Stay in line. Walk firmly. Walk with a purpose, but don't, run ahead and get down and run ahead and get down. There wasn't this idea of fire and maneuver that we have in today's army, where you're going to go up and fire and then plop yourself down on the ground, okay, and take cover and let somebody else come up. That was developed later on in the war, but in the early part of the war, in the first 3 years, you were supposed to get up from the trench in line and move forward. And you've probably seen that famous World War I picture where the guys are getting up out of the trench, and you can actually see them getting up and then falling one at a time until there's only one guy left. You've seen that all. And so it didn't work. And so I don't think there was a good connect. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'd just like to correct you saying that most of the German leaders who signed, the politicians who signed the peace treaty were Jewish.
I didn't say most, I said some.
Some. It's really only Walter Rathenau that we know of.
Right.
Matthias Erzberger, who led the Catholic Center Party and who defended blacks, who had investigated the massacre of blacks early in 1907, was Catholic. And both he and Rathenau were murdered about a year and a half.
Yeah, they're killed by the Nazis. But they were Nazis at the time. They were.
Actually,
other
Admiral
people.
Canaris headed
Yeah.
several hit teams that murdered, and then later he was executed by Hitler himself.
Right. Hey, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. In 1995, I was part of the planning for UN 50 in San Francisco.
Pardon me?
In 1995, I was part of the planning of UN 50 in
Yes.
San Francisco. And the head of it was Ambassador Richard Butler. And he wanted to go to Stanford, where I work, to meet with the international, department. And because they're looking at changing the charter of the UN and including and expanding the Security Council. And one of the members asked him, would, in the Security Council, if it was expanded, would they include Japan or Germany? And he said not in his lifetime. And about 4 years ago, I asked the then French ambassador here that same question, and he said he agreed. Do you have a sense of that?
Well, as far as the animosity that still exists,
Yes. Because I was shocked, when...
yeah, I'm not shocked. I think the animosity now from the First World War is obviously because most of the not most, but all the participants are dead now. But I think from the Second World War and the occupation, obviously, there's still a lot of animosity between the French and British. But I will say that for the first time in a long time, I think it was about 5 years ago or so, in Normandy, the German representatives were invited to the, not the celebration, but to the remembrance ceremonies in Normandy. Likewise, the German cemeteries in France were not allowed to be mowed, okay? And would oftentimes grow, by French. In other words, people had to come from Germany, volunteers from Germany, to care for the German cemeteries, and they would have volunteer groups. And so in the German cemeteries in France, you would see grass sometimes up to your knees in certain sections, and other sections would be mowed perfectly because that's all they had time to mow, that group of volunteers that came over. But they made an agreement about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I can't remember, it's not that long ago. Of course, when you're getting old, everything seems like yesterday, right? They made an agreement, I think it was for the 65th anniversary, that French could be hired to do the mowing and care of the German cemeteries. And so those cemeteries are now cared for like the Commonwealth cemeteries and the French cemeteries. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
How much intelligence did they have on each side about what the other was doing?
Well, quite a bit, actually. Most of it was wrong, but one of the biggest oxymorons is military intelligence, right? There was quite a bit of intelligence that was going on. Of course, there were famous spies like Mata Hari and people like that who was working for the Germans, was found out and executed. The Turks, by the way, come in on the side of the Central Powers, meaning Austria and Germany, toward the war. Of course, there's a famous battle of Gallipoli with the Australians that are there. And but there is quite a bit of spying going on. How much good did it do? Not very much, mainly, and because the lines are so stagnated, there really, intelligence didn't play a great part, even though there were tremendous attempts, to find out what was going on. Tanks are called tanks. That was a big intelligence thing, by the way. The reason those armored vehicles are called tanks is because the English thought that's a good code word. We're making tanks. They look like water tanks, right? And so it was a code word. That's why we call them tanks today. Only because that's what the English started calling them. Okay? But I mean, as far as intelligence, it really wasn't consequential in the First World War. It wasn't mean it didn't happen, they weren't trying.
Unintelligent.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
What were the German casualties?
The German casualties, let me get my little cheat sheet here. They were tremendous also. Germany lost more soldiers killed than France. 1,773,000 killed, with a 4,126,000 wounded, for a total of 7,142,000 compared to the French 6 million. But remember, the German population was greater. So more, percentage of the French had the highest percentage of deaths and wounded in the First World War. But the Germans lost more total. Good question.
And there probably were very few German civilian casualties, right? Because it was fought on French soil.
As far as accuracy, you mean?
Civilians.
Oh, civilian casualties, no. There were an incredible amount of civilian casualties during that time, but not as many as you might think. And the reason is because the front was so stagnated, many of the French people moved away from there and so weren't caught. It wasn't in a war of movement, so they weren't caught in as casualties during the war.
But my comment went to the German civilians.
Oh, German civilians?
I thought that because it was fought on French soil, I would.
Oh, there weren't very many German civilians. Now, I'll leave you with this last thought, though. One of the most horrific things of the First World War was that at the end of the First World War, in the last months of the First World War, there was an incredible flu epidemic. Okay? And I told you about the millions of casualties in the First World War. It dwarfed by 1/3 those that died of the flu, influenza. And that flu was brought back to the United States of America by guess who? The soldiers. It was brought back. And so if some of you had relatives that died of the flu, my father had the flu. He was born in 1914. He got the flu. He survived, obviously. He was 4 years old. But he said he still remembers, one of his first memories was he would wake up, he was 4 years old, he would hear this church bell ringing, and he thought he was in heaven, okay? And he had recovered from the flu. He'd been out for several days, unconscious from the flu, and survived, but many did not. The greatest flu epidemic the world has ever seen, when we talk about Ebola and everything else, occurred right after the First World War. And the casualties in the First World War were 1/3 of what the casualties were of the great flu epidemic of 1918. 1/3. And very little known. Okay, thanks again.
Thank you, everyone. We're just at 8:30, so finish up on time. Thank you, Tom. Chapter 2, World War II and the 71st anniversary next year. I haven't even asked Tom yet, but I'm hoping we can get him back up here to talk. And so hopefully you will see us at a few events before then. But in the meantime, thank you for coming. You mentioned Lafayette's ship. That, in fact, will be coming back to Alexandria next year. So that is a pretty exciting event for the city of Alexandria, and our sister city will help support that in whatever way we can. I want to say thank you for a special guest in the back, Mayor Buell. Thank you for coming. Appreciate you coming out. Our committee is just full of a bunch of ideas for events and lectures, and if you know of ideas for fundraising or venues, please find one of our members. We're just a bunch of volunteers that like French stuff, and if you can help support any of our efforts, we'd love to have you help. Thank you.